Hello, this is Pete Droge, and you're watching Time to Connect.
Hey, Pete Droge, thank you so much for taking the time to connect.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man, I've been really looking forward to this. We've been trying to do this. I think I first reached out to you. I'm thinking a couple of years ago, and between maybe some health issues you had and some scheduling issues, it took us a while, but here we are finally.
Here we are. Yep.
I'm very grateful to have you. As I've told you on our correspondence, I've been following you for quite a while. Actually, since 1995, if maybe four. Our mutual friend Peter Blackstock turned my then girlfriend, now wife, and I onto Necktie Second when we were up in Seattle visiting him. I believe it was 95. And man, we wore this CD
There it
out.
is. Yeah.
I'm telling you, man, we wore it out. I do want to chat just a little bit about that. Obviously, we want to get to your new record, which is will probably be the bulk of our conversation. But before we jump into all that, do you mind just doing a little potted bio for anyone who doesn't know you? I will put show notes, links to you in the show notes, but yeah, just a quick bio of who you are.
Sure. It's funny. Just the other day, I decided when people ask, you say you're a musician, well, what do you play? I decided, you know what? The actual answer is I'm a multi-instrumentalist. So I'm, mainly play guitar, but I'm a multi-instrumentalist. I'm about to start a film score right now. So, kind of get my piano chops back and my bass and drum chops and stuff. So I'm a singer-songwriter type. You might say, quote unquote, recording artist, performing artist. Kind of that Necktie Second record that you mentioned, that was my debut. I was signed to American Recordings, which is Rick Rubin's label, by a great producer named Brendan O'Brien, was my A&R person there, and made three major label records with Brendan in the 90s. And then after that, I was dropped by Epic in late 99, and then kind of went, into the indie world. Made a record for United Musicians, which was sort of an artist-owned label collective that Amy Mann and Michael Penn and our manager that we shared at the time, Michael Hausman, had started. So I put a record out that way called Skywatching. And that came out right at the same time as my side project with Matthew Sweet and Shawn Mullins. We did a record for Columbia as The Thorns. That was our three-part harmony band. Around that time also, I started doing work as a film composer and television stuff. So, and also began working a lot in the 2000s as a record producer here in my studio. Had a nice kind of run there in the 2000s, juggling between the record production and film scoring, and did some work, advertising, composing. And then would just sort of, pepper in work on my own albums, kind of quietly, sort of under the radar. Stopped touring after the Thorns, so hadn't done any touring for many, many years. Around 2015, chronic fatigue entered my life, and that may be something we can talk about a little bit later in more detail. That kind of derailed the so-called career for a while, and spent a lot of time in recovery, and it also gave me a chance to kind of sort of do a lot of soul searching and kind of self-care work. Started easing back into creativity and work, although all that time I was writing songs. And again, this is something we can talk in more detail about later. But a few years ago, I kind of started to feel better enough that I was able to kind of get back to work, and started a Substack newsletter. That was kind of the way I kind of eased back in, and then started chipping away at making the album, Fade Away Blue, that was released last year. And I'm just kind of, now I'm back after a year of really focusing on the so-called recording artist and performing artist side of things. I'm now kind of back to that sort of comfortable zone that I like, of kind of being, what do they say, a multi-hyphenate, kind of being a film composer, and I'm going to be doing some record production this year. And, I'll continue to chip away at making my own records. So, yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's kind of the quick rundown, I think.
Yeah, we could.
Just a lifer. I've been, making music one way or another since I was 4 years old. I started banging on songs on my mom's ukulele, and just music is just a huge part of my life.
We can talk maybe later if it comes up about how dramatically things have changed since 1994 when you put out that first record.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
changed a lot, in good and bad ways.
yeah.
One question I like to ask people is, what were you like as a kid? That's a little bit of a kind of a, I don't know, a tough question, but I'm just curious how you respond to that. What were you like as a kid?
Um, that is, how do you sort of distill that? I was definitely a very motivated kid. Um, I was, I excelled at school. I had a good memory. I could memorize stuff, and I also was good at kind of cracking the code of like what was going to be on the quiz. So in my early childhood, I was kind of like the straight A kid. I was, taking piano lessons and, playing the hardest piece in the thing and, headlining the piano recital. So I think, maybe a little bit of an overachiever type. Um, I was pretty social, As we got a little bit older, I think I was kind of a click jumper. I definitely by, high school time, I was, mostly entrenched in the parking lot, smoking cigarettes and hanging with my fellow stoner kids, with the ripped up jeans jacket and the greasy, starting to get long hair kind of vibe.
And
Um,
is this in the Pacific Northwest? Were you in Tacoma
yeah,
or I mean
uh, Bainbridge Island,
Bainbridge Island?
which
Okay,
is
beautiful,
an island just straight across from downtown Seattle.
so
Yeah,
beautiful.
so but at that same time that I was mainly kind of a sort of parking lot stoner kid, I also had friends that were the jock guys, and I was definitely into the art scene. I was an actor from the time I was about 8 years old. I made my premiere in Beans Brew and Mulligan Stew. Followed that with Norska Borska Smorgasbord, and I had the lead role in the local production of Tom Sawyer. So I was pretty serious into the acting thing. So I had friends that were kind of in that clique as well, and so yeah, I think a little bit of a clique jumper. Um, but I also just kind of felt, I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I just sort of wanted to get into the big city and jump into the whole world of music. So I don't know if that gives you enough of a
Yeah,
picture, but I was
yeah.
definitely, I definitely had, the tortured artist kind of soul. I think definitely, probably more so as I moved into adolescence. I think I was a bit more um, even keel through my younger years and a bit more resilient. And then when I kind of got into adolescence, there was some stuff I won't get into details, but there were some trauma experiences that I think combined with the drug use and alcohol abuse and all of that kind of made for some more tumultuous internal landscape that, by the time I was a teenager, it was a definitely, not surprisingly, angst-filled young man, which is not not uncommon.
No,
So,
and it makes sometimes for some pretty good art.
right.
And one more question about this. I know you said you were making music early on with your mom's ukulele and whatnot. Do you remember how old you were when you said, "This is what I want to do for a living"?
Pretty young. Yeah, I was grade school age when sort of the 70s rock star fantasy, got a hold of me. Um, and in those days, we didn't really know what that meant. This was, we had the magazines or whatever in the backs of albums to kind of get a picture of what that would be. But that got a hold of me pretty young. Like I said, I was, music has always just really been a part of my life. My birth mother was a musician and a violin player and music teacher. My mom, who raised me, was a music teacher. Um, so I think there was kind of the nature and the nurture there. Um, I think by the time I got into middle school and I transitioned to guitar, I got kind of more into it and more passionate about it. There was a period, in my grade school years, I started piano lessons at about second grade. And there was definitely a time that, mom was like, you have to do your practice. Like, it's not a choice. And it was torture because all my friends were running around in the field across the street playing, tag football or whatever. And, I had to sit there and play my scales. I'm really grateful that she sort of forced that upon me because it served me well ultimately. But by the time junior high school came around and I transitioned to guitar, that's when my passion was just unbridled. And I literally remember running home, like sprinting, like as fast as possible to get to my bedroom so that I could grab my new electric guitar and play.
Who were you listening to in those days? Who comes to mind if I say who are you listening to?
Middle school was a lot of classic rock. Huge AC/DC fan. Played along with AC/DC records a lot, and it might not be totally evident to people who listen to my music, but like Malcolm Young, his rhythm guitar playing was extremely influential on my playing. Like his right hand and his feel and his rhythm was just ingrained from playing along with those records. Just all the usual suspects: Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin. But I was also turned on to a lot of like singer-songwriter stuff by my parents. So my parents were a bit older than most of my friends' parents, but had really hip taste. So there was a really pivotal moment the summer after fifth grade. My parents had a party and they were listening to Bridge Over Troubled Water. And I was down the hall, sleeping while the parents and their friends were hooting it up in the other room. And I remember hearing the song Cecilia. And I was like, oh, I love that. And I went and I rifled through the collection and found that record. And that was really the day that the road forked off from, I was fully into Kiss as like a grade school kid. I loved Kiss. It was like Kiss and Bachman Turner Overdrive. My dad had a BTO record, and like those were kind of the only things I listened to. And then once I heard Cecilia and Simon and Garfunkel, it's like I totally veered off into more of the folk rock singer-songwriter stuff. Dylan was another artist that my dad had some Dylan records, and I delved into that, and we had a Donovan record, and we had all the blockbuster stuff around the house. I remember as a kid hearing, we had Fleetwood Mac Rumors and the Eagles' Greatest Hits and Elton John and James Taylor, so that stuff was just around, and I absorbed that a lot. And so I was kind of on a dual path there, sort of in junior high school and high school. I was definitely into all the sort of young boy rock. Aerosmith was big. I discovered punk rock in high school, and was I was more into more of the poppy melodic stuff. Like I really liked the Descendants. They were like one of my favorite bands of that mode. Definitely just Stones were huge. I think it was around probably seventh grade or so that the Stones got their hooks in me, and like, I was the kind of kid who like make my list of like my top 10 bands, like the Stones would always be number one.
And still no mention of the Beatles.
Not, it's funny because, people sort of have that, like, what are you, Beatles or Stones? It's like right away. I don't even have to think about it. Although, I had a copy of the White Album. I listened to that a lot. I love Abbey Road. I love Revolver. I love Rubber Soul. But there's just, as much as I love them and appreciate them, I was never like fully obsessed with them like I was with the Stones or with AC/DC or some of the other stuff, Yeah.
So before we talk about Fade Away Blue, can we just revisit Necktie Second for a moment?
Sure, yeah.
So that had to be quite a dramatic change in your life, the way that thing got huge pretty quick. I think I remember reading somewhere that Robert Hilburn compared you to Dylan, I think, maybe.
Yeah, he did. He did.
I mean, that's
I don't know. Was he comparing like he is nowhere near as good as Dylan? Or whatever? Yeah, he did have something in there that was kind of like, I can't remember how it was worded. Something like, I'll see if I can rack the memory banks here. I think it was a little bit in comparison with where I was from in Seattle. So I think it was a kind of like a, his music is more akin to his heroes, Dylan. I think he mentioned Graham Parsons and Tom Petty, something like that. It wasn't like he's the. I never got the next Bob Dylan tag, thankfully.
Right. Right.
Who needs that pressure? But yeah,
Right.
yeah. He was an early supporter, and I think at the time, especially, his it carried a lot of weight, his approval and his sort of giving you the thumbs up. So
Did it feel a little bit like an overnight thing that you went from obscurity to being
not
pretty well
really.
known? Really?
No, it didn't. Interestingly, it was kind of a slow burn, where the record came out in May of '94. We just went out and did this residency tour of the Northeast where we played in circles for 7 weeks, and it was kind of a slow burn. We were building, and by later in the year, the first single was Stralin Street. It did okay at AAA radio, and then If You Don't Love Me followed and started kind of working its way up the charts a little bit. And then the Dumb and Dumber thing is kind of when things kind of escalated. And that was kind of towards the end of the year. I mean, if you want to talk about overnight success, I watched the Counting Crows documentary. Like that was like instant. Like before their record came out, they were playing the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and then it just exploded out of the gate. And I think, my vantage point, my view of whatever so-called air quotes success that I had was definitely kind of skewed by just how huge things were in those days. The mid 90s, a
Yeah.
blockbuster record was like Diamond, like 15 million copies or whatever. Like people were selling so many records
Yeah.
that, and I was managed by Pearl Jam's manager and was friends with those guys and other musician friends who were, wildly successful. So it always felt pretty modest, and
Cool.
and it felt like kind of a slow burn, which I think, served me well ultimately because, once that stuff kind of started to pick up, we got the Dumb and Dumber thing late in '94, and that sort of, the soundtrack and the video getting picked up by MTV and getting on Letterman and the Jon Stewart show and all of that stuff just kind of kept it building and building, so that when we came around the turn into '95, we still had wind in our sails, which doesn't always happen, especially majors in those days. It wasn't uncommon for a major label to, spend a lot of money on a record, spray the money hose on it out the gate, and then kind of give up on it pretty quick. So the fact that we could kind of come into '95 and spent the entirety of '95 still on the road supporting that record, and picked up opening spots. We kind of ended '94 opening for Melissa Etheridge when her record was #1. We ended up out with Sheryl Crow for a while early in '95, and then of course the Tom Petty tour came along, which was just total dream come true and
What year was
great
that?
visibility. That was '95. Yeah, so that was
95.
that
Still
started, I think.
95, Petty.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
the Dogs with Wings tour, which was the Wildflowers album they were supporting.
Wow.
And then we got over to Europe and got great press over there, and we're just shocked to like show up in Germany and play a 500 seat club and it's packed and you're doing 3 encores and they're singing along. It's like we got on some of the huge festivals over there that summer, and so yeah, it was but still all that said, I think kind of the deadly comparison game, it still seemed pretty modest and small compared to everything else going on at the time. And I think from the label's perspective, I'm sure they would have liked to have hung a gold record on the wall for all the effort that everybody put into it. But this is something that came up the other day. Magnet Magazine they have a thing called Magnet Classics where they do these audio documentaries about albums, and they're putting one together about Necktie Second. And they emailed to kind of ask about the sales, and we kind of talked about the fact that the Dumb and Dumber soundtrack, where it was like the single from that soundtrack, that went gold. And I think a lot of the sales and the momentum that we got from the radio and the movie exposure, a lot of that went to sales of the soundtrack album. So
I know you've worked with Shawn Mullins. I've heard him talk about his kind of overnight success, and I mean that came fast and really hard for him. And one of the things he talks about there is how much pressure the record company did put on him, and how he kind of fairly quickly felt like he was in a place he didn't want to be. And did you have any of that at all?
I think I was lucky to be on American Recordings.
Yeah.
This was Rick Rubin's label,
Right.
very artist friendly. My A&R person was also my producer, so we never had that. Like Brendan and I, we made the record we wanted to make. We didn't have the meddling, we didn't have the classic "I don't hear a single" thing. They weren't controlling about anything. In a way, as I sort of look back in hindsight, I might have had more success had they been more hands-on. Like if they had said, "Hey, let's put a picture of your fresh 24-year-old face on the cover of the album. How about that?" Or, helped me with better merch ideas. Like my merch, I didn't put my name on my T-shirt. Like brilliant marketing ideas like that. So I didn't get a taste of any of that. So I made the first record with Brendan as my A&R person, and then he left his role at American, but we still made my second record, Find a Door, for American with him producing. And then he left to start his own label at Epic Records called 57 Records. And so between the second and third record, he bought me out of my contract from Rick and took me over to Epic. And then we made Spacey and Shaken. Again, we just kind of made the record we wanted to make. But it was after Spacey and Shaken, and that record just really kind of came and went. Like it didn't connect. And I think, I could probably go into some of the politics with the brass at the label that I think informed the fact, when you're on Epic Records and they don't make a music video, you're not a priority. You know what I mean? So there was that. And it was in the wake of that album where I was here working on writing the material for the album. That's the first time I kind of felt that kind of pressure and that little devil on my shoulder. I'd be working on a song and it might be kind of a mid-tempo, melancholy singer-songwriter thing. And, that's not going to get on the radio, Pete. That's the first time I kind of dealt with that. And then as fate would have it, they dropped me shortly after that. So I didn't have to live with that little voice in my ear for very long. But I remember thinking, like, I could turn in Blowing in the Wind and they would not give a shit. Like this, and who knows what they want. And if you start playing that game of trying to give them what they want, you're over, So So and the other thing is I didn't have near the success that Shawn had. So, you're talking, a global smash, top 10, Hot 100, baby. Like
overnight.
That is huge.
Yeah.
And, so, I didn't really have to contend with that.
Speaking of a voice in your head, still the voice of Pete Droge in my head, almost 30 years later, is Sunspot Stopwatch.
Nice.
Anything that you can say about that song? Is there a story behind that song?
Well, actually, speaking of our mutual friend Peter Blackstock, I wrote that song when I was in Austin in '93. Peter was really instrumental in kind of getting my career off the ground. He helped me, help pay for my flight to come down to South by Southwest in '93, and connected me with everybody in town. Obviously he was living in Seattle at the time, but had deep roots in Austin, and got me a bunch of gigs. He got me a gig with Alejandro, Tony Price. He got me slots at, the Cactus Cafe and all these cool gigs around town, kind of leading up to South by Southwest. He helped me put together a killer band for my showcase down there. And at one point, and I don't know how this worked, we were at a friend of his house, and I don't remember who it was, and everybody else was gone. Like they were there, and so I'm in some stranger's house for the afternoon, and I had my guitar, and that's where I wrote that song. It's one of those just kind of word salad songs. It's actually recently when we've played it live recently. So some of the gigs we did recently with the Necktie Second double vinyl reissue thing, I would open the show with Northern Bound Train, and then I would go right into Sunspot Stopwatch. And then after Sunspot, I would do a little banter. And one of the things I said some of the times was, if anybody can tell me what that song's about, please let me know. But I was a big fan of, some of that surrealistic, psychedelic, cryptic, poetic, whatever you want to call it, opaque, vague, mysterious kind of lyric,
Dylan-esque.
Yeah, and John Lennon, he did it pretty good too.
Sure. Oh yeah.
So I enjoyed that, and still to this day, even though I definitely work in a different way, where that style of writing doesn't really turn me on like it did then.
Sure.
But still, it's the phrasing and the way the words roll off the tongue and the
Yeah.
way they fit together and the way they interact
Yes.
with each other. Like internal rhymes and just the percussiveness of it and the shapes and the feeling of it. To me,
Absolutely.
that's
Yeah.
the mark of a well-written song. You can really, you can listen to a song. In fact, I was thinking about this just earlier today. I just got a song across the finish line last night. This was one that was just a mad puzzle to figure out. I've never spent as much time trying to figure out just the order of the sections. And Elaine and I finally cracked the code last night. And this morning I was listening to it, and I could tune into, it's a joy to sing. Like the phrasing, like every word just flows.
Yeah.
Like, sometimes you have to kind of leave that clunky line in there because there's no other way to say what you need to say. This one is just all smooth sailing. And I actually thought to myself this morning while I was listening to my little phone sketch of it, I was like, is that part of what people enjoy about listening to a song? Is that it's easy to sing? Or do they have no awareness of that at all? It's kind of an interesting question to
I
to
I think it's
wonder if,
both.
yeah,
I think it's both. I think they aren't aware that that's what they like about it, but that's what
right.
they like about it, I think.
Yeah, yeah,
And I'm a songwriter as well, and I know exactly what you mean. There's when you nail it, and that song of yours nails it. It doesn't matter what the words are. It's the sound fits that part of the melody like a glove, and you just
yeah,
know it. You
yeah.
just know it. And when I hear a song like that, it makes me want to write. And
Mm, yeah, me too.
so thank you for that. Maybe we'll segue. We'll skip about 30 years and
Sure, let's do it.
segue into Fade Away Blue. Although, as we get into the backstory of Fade Away Blue, that kind of helps fill in some of the things that have happened to you over those years. First of all, I just want to congratulate you on the record. It's a beautiful record, and what a lineup of players! My
Oh,
goodness, man.
yeah,
Two of my favorites, Greg Leisz and Jay Bellerose, are on that record.
yeah,
Um, I've actually had Bill Frisell on this podcast twice,
yeah,
and of course
yeah,
he's worked with Greg, and I've had Larry Goldings on the podcast, and he's worked with Jay, and those two
yeah,
guys have become two of my favorite sidemen. And when I saw they were on your record, that really was exciting for me. Although you have other great players too. Maybe
yeah.
talk for just a moment about how that ensemble came about.
Well, it kind of began with Jay. Jay had played on the side project that I did with my wife Elaine Summers called the Droge Summers Blend. We had used Jay on that, and I had used him on a little bit of film scoring stuff. And then he played on a record that I produced for a group called Moody Little Sister. So, I'm just a huge fan. I mean, we could just spend the rest of the hour just talking about Jay, and he's, I don't use the word lightly, but I think he's a musical genius, and just such a soulful player and a song guy. He could do anything he wants, but he supports the song. So I knew that I wanted Jay on the record, and his wife, Jennifer Condos, is a great bass player. And so that was the original intention, was for the two of them. And I was actually talking with Jen about, I kind of had the songs taking shape for the record and thinking about what I wanted to do. And I was trying to figure out, to self-produce again or to get a producer involved. And I had a list of producers and mix engineers that I'd compiled over the years, just from hearing a record go, ooh, that's so cool. I'm making note of who did that. And one of those producers was Paul Bryan. And Paul also appealed to me from his string arranging work. And the records that he's produced for Amy Mann, they always just sound fantastic, and they're so well arranged and produced. So I was kind of brainstorming with Jen about, how I might make the record. And I had mentioned Paul, and she was just like, I think you and Paul would be a great combination. She really, really encouraged me to take that seriously. Unfortunately, she sort of talked herself out of a gig in a way, because she knows that Paul is also an excellent bass player. And Paul, when he's producing, he likes to play the bass himself. And she was cool with that. And the three of them, Jen and Jay and Paul, they go way back. They gig together. They make records together. In fact, Paul and Jay go like back to the 80s. They've been playing together, and Paul has, recorded Jay in the studio a ton. And so that also appealed to me, that Paul understands how to work with Jay. You don't kind of do a conventional miking and stuff. You adapt to his unconventional tunings and instruments that he uses and stuff. So anyway, that's kind of how the core team came together. So we just started working on, I think, a couple songs out of the gate. And this was in the midst of my chronic fatigue era, which began in 2015. I was still, I was coming out of it, but, still definitely squarely in the fatigue zone. And I was able to track here at my studio my vocals and guitars, and most of the time, 8 out of 9 times, to like a click track or a drum machine. And then I would send the files down to Los Angeles where Paul had his studio, and then we would overdub the drums, and I would sit right here. There's technology now where they can have a plug-in on their mix bus and send me a link, and I could hear out of these speakers here like full high resolution audio in almost real time. And so the way I've talked about it, I was like a blind fly on the wall. I could hear everything perfectly, but I couldn't really see what was going on. I just keep my phone handy, and I basically said, just, go ahead and work. If I have any thoughts or comments, I'll text you, and then we can just have a phone call. So we worked remotely like that, and then the rest of the team was sort of assembled through Paul's relationships mostly. I had worked with Greg on the Thorns record, so he was when I thought pedal steel, obviously he came to mind.
Yeah.
When we were thinking about a little bit of lead guitar, electric guitar, I just asked Paul, like, hey, who do you think would be good on this track? That's the title track, Fade Away Blue. And he goes, well, we could call my friend Rusty Anderson. He lives right down the street. And I wasn't familiar with Rusty. And I said, well, what's he done? He says, well, he's been in Paul McCartney's band for the last 20 odd years. I'm like, okay, that should work. He's probably pretty good. And sure enough, he was amazing. And then Lee Pardini is another like kind of core member of the band on the album, keyboard player, formerly of the Dawes. He was with Dawes for many years, and then recently left Dawes and is now with Chris Stapleton on his record, and tours with Chris Stapleton, and does session work and makes amazing records of his own. And then Gabe Witcher, the fiddle player, was another friend of Paul's who came in to play the fiddle. And then locally here in Seattle, I enlisted Nova Karina Divone to play the accordion, who's someone I had worked with before, who, doesn't have the resume that all these people do. Gabe, is another one who has a resume that's like as impressive as Greg's or Jay's. I mean, it's incredible. Everybody he's played with, Elton John, Paul Simon, just, it goes on and on. While Nova didn't have all those fancy household names on her resume, she's every bit as great a musician, and so she kind of rounded out the lineup. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention my partner in crime, Elaine Summers, who Paul refers to as our secret weapon on the album. With her vocals, add just that extra little bit of zazz, and co-wrote 6 of the 10 songs, and served as executive producer as well. So like really was kind of overseeing the whole process, and super instrumental.
Well, it is a beautiful record. It's a million miles away from Necktie Second in a couple of ways. I was thinking about, this is not a fair comparison, so take this with a grain of salt, but I was thinking, if we were talking poetic traditions, Necktie Second would be maybe in the modernist, if not Wallace Stevens, definitely not personal, not that personal. And Fade Away Blue would be almost in the confessional. I mean, it's so much more emotional, it's so much more direct. Actually, if you don't mind, let me read something, just a little blurb that one critic wrote, and then have you comment on this. This is an emotionally heavy album, spurred on by Droge's effort to reconnect with his birth mother. 16 years ago, he started his search only to find an obituary for her. Across 10 songs, the delicately beautiful record soundtracks Droge dealing with the news, but also discovering his surviving relatives, an appreciation for his adoptive parents, coping with his adoptive father's passing, and his adoptive mother's declining health, all while contending with a mysterious illness of his own. Does that Is that a pretty good summary?
Pretty succinct. Yeah, that pretty much covers it. Yeah. What's that from there?
Oh gosh, I'm sorry I didn't write down the
Oh,
source. I
okay.
can let you
Okay.
know
Yeah.
later.
Yeah.
I just was poking around the internet
Yeah. Yeah.
looking for thoughts on you, and I'd be happy to send that to you.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, songs like "Sundown" at Francis Nash, almost some of those lines are almost painful. Can you just talk maybe about why you made that decision after all these years to get a lot more direct and personal?
I think it was kind of just a natural progression. I think growing up, I think facing the term that the phrase that came to mind that I almost was trying to self-edit was sort of facing my demons. Um, doing a lot of introspection and self-reflection and inner work. Having moved through a lot of that, I think there was a pattern of avoidance early in life, and certainly, Sundown at Francis Nash kind of speaks to that. This is, the song is set, in my wild teenage drug-addled psychedelic period, which I sort of alluded to earlier,
Mhm.
kind of trying to numb out and escape from
Yeah.
what was going on, and I, like the bridge kind of speaks to it, like, I thought psychedelic, like LSD, what a great way to escape. Not so much, buddy.
Right.
You
Right.
end up in a house of mirrors,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so I think, having done that work and having, you know, reflected a lot on, in midlife, it all kind of started around the time I was 40, where I really was kind of asking, what's going on? Like, where is this anxiety and this depression? And where did that substance abuse, like, what's behind that? And so that's when, a few years before that is when I started, you know, I read Eckhart Tolle's A New Earth. That book just completely opened up a lot for me, and started a serious meditation practice around that time, and started to kind of, delve into Buddhist philosophy. So that was all unlocking a lot as far as, kind of unraveling or trying to sort of get a handle on the scaffolding that I'd sort of built around, what they might call Buddha nature or true self, the sort of protective infrastructure or whatever, that I'd sort of built around that vulnerable soft spot. So I think if you're wading into that water, you're going to be more prone to just being open and truthful and clear in your work, rather than when you're young and confused and don't know what the fuck is going on.
Sure.
So
Sure.
I think that kind of was at play for sure.
As a songwriter myself, I do find it more difficult to write those songs, though. A song like Sunspot Stopwatch is easier in the sense that you don't worry too much about the meaning. You're just going for the words that feel right, as we talked about earlier, and that sound right, and that go with the melody, and that just, that roll off the tongue. But now, if we're going to be a little more narrative, a little more direct, whew,
And
we
truthful and
it
honest.
it it
Yeah.
it's tough.
Yeah.
Do you find that to be the case as well?
I would say definitively yes and definitively no. I would say it's both easier and harder.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is, I think it's easier to, when in doubt, if you just can go, like, just check in with three chords and the truth. And you can kind of go, okay, well, what's true that I can say? What's honest and what's real? So in that sense, you have this, you have a roadmap. You have something that you can lean on when in doubt, when you don't know where to go.
But
But that's really
how,
difficult. That's
how do I
hard
do that
sometimes.
without falling into cliche? right?
Yeah, I don't worry too much about cliche. You know, it's funny. I read a book about writing lyrics, and it just, you know, kind of kept hammering on, you know, don't use cliches, don't use cliches. And then he had a list of all these cliches that you shouldn't use. And like, there's one of my favorite songs. There's another one of my favorite songs.
Right, right.
You know, and speaking of the
Yeah.
Stones, I mean, Mick
Oh,
Jagger, man,
yeah,
king of the cliche. So,
yeah.
but I
Good
think, you know,
point.
there's using cliches in a skillful way, and then there's being cliche. I think what you're speaking to as far as
Yes,
being cliche,
yes,
absolutely, yeah, try to
yeah,
avoid that for sure.
yeah.
But I think, you know, it's ultimately more healing and cathartic and um, just satisfying for me, like the writing that I'm doing now. Um, I just feel more connection to those songs, and I think part of what led me to that, when you sort of ask, like, I think, did you kind of ask, like, sort of what sort of led to that? I would say part of it was returning to playing live again after not playing live for many, many years, and then going back over my catalog and recognizing the songs that hold up for me. You know, I'm extremely happy with my body of work when it comes to chords, melodies, feel, vibe, the recordings. I like the way the records sound, the way they're produced. The one place where I would critique myself if I could have a little time machine and go back would be the lyrics. And that's where I might say, you know, like, hey, Pete, you know, there's such thing as a second draft. Did you know that you can go back and change it and maybe make it
Yeah,
better? You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
but I was kind of subscribing to the kind of shoot from the hip, you know, move fast, you know, trust your gut,
First
you
thought,
know.
best thought.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, back to the Buddhist thing,
Yeah,
and there's a place for that for sure.
sure.
But so having gone back and then figuring out, you know, what songs we want to play live, some of them I was like, well, yeah, I just can't get behind this song. I can't feel it. There's not enough there, truthfully or emotionally or just so that definitely made me, you know, raise the bar to, you know, really try to write songs that I can really invest myself in, and you know, and I had discovered that pretty early on. I think, you know, I did want to have some sort of emotional um, seed, you know, like all of the music is built out of something real. I never kind of sat down and just like was cerebral from the neck up, like, oh, I need a song that's kind of like this so it could get on the radio. It was always you know, the initial instinct or the initial seed would always come from something that, you know, I had a real feeling about. But it's like the level of craft, that's what's really different now. And it's been, you know, a gradual progression of Elaine and I in our writing together that has moved us towards just higher standards. I think, you know, being a Leonard Cohen fan and reading about his process, you know, that's inspiring. Elaine's role and relationship in the co-writing is also has a lot to do with that evolution. She, like when you were saying before, like, hey, if it sounds cool and it's blah blah blah, like, I'm good. She's not that way at all. Like, she's one of these people who, like, well, what's it about? You know, she wants to, you know, get a sense of what the singer is singing about. So I can kind of come to the table with, you know, raw ideas and maybe a line for a chorus or an opening line in a verse, and then where I would tend historically to be pretty content to, you know, just sort of yellow matter custard dripping down a dead dog's eye my way to the end or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, uh,
She's not going to have it.
I hope I got that quote right there. If not,
Close
I'm
enough.
sorry, John. But she's more like, okay, well, what's the core? And we kind of got into that around the time we were writing the End of the Waves record. When we were co-writing, that's when we started to really kind of use the word core a lot. Well, what's the core of this song? You know, because it's, you know, I think you can kind of go like, and then a tangent, and then another tangent. It's like you kind of get far away from like, well, what was this song? What was the core of it? You know?
Yeah.
So that became a pretty integral part of the songwriting process, was, you know, that part of like sitting down with her and kind of, you know, getting a little bit more from the neck up and asking like, okay, what are we trying to say? What's the story? But also, when it is more confessional and autobiographical, and direct, um, like I said before, you can just always kind of come back to, well, what's the story? It's like, so yeah, I'm still on that track. I may at some point have a hankering to write word salad songs again, and that would be fun.
You bet.
But right now, like the record that we're kind of working our way towards, and like very slow and steady pre-production, will be kind of like Fade Away Blue, companion piece,
Gotcha.
and will continue to be autobiographical and confessional, but it's going to have a bit more of a lighthearted moments within it. There's some of the songs that have a little bit of levity to them.
Okay, nice. Well, we look forward to that. Hey, let's wrap up with some kind of rapid fire short answer questions, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Um, I feel like we could talk for hours, but I want to respect your time, and I actually need to wrap up anyway.
Okay.
Uh, so let's see. Do you sit your meditation practice in any particular tradition?
I'm mostly follow a teacher named Gil Fronsdal, who's a
Yeah,
Vipassana,
yeah, yeah. I know
and
Gil.
he's amazing. I love
Yeah,
him.
he's great.
Yeah, yeah.
He's great for sure. And any would that also extend to the Buddhist philosophy that you follow? Is it more in that Gil's tradition?
I think so. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I like Gil, for his lack of dogma,
yeah,
and I think he's a really good fit for a Western lens.
mhm,
Um, and yeah, he's a remarkable teacher. Yeah, I have his. I've never met him in person or anything. We've had a little bit of an email exchange when I set some of his talk, a little piece of his talk, to music around the time the COVID lockdown was happening. I used a piece of ambient music of mine, and put a little clip of him speaking, and had a little email exchange with him. But beyond that,
cool.
I haven't met him, but he's remarkable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he is. I noticed on your website you don't have any shows coming up. Are you anything in the works? Are you planning on playing live again soon?
The plan was to not play at all in 2026 after last year of, sort of donning my so-called recording and performing artist cap. I decided this year that I wanted to get back in the studio, and I'm about to begin, or actually kind of have begun, pre-production on a film score, and I think I mentioned earlier, some record production work.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, just really, and I wanted to have sort of the time for my new album to really kind of percolate, and let that stew cook.
Okay.
And yeah, so we decided not to tour in 26. We do have, it hasn't been announced yet, but there was a festival near home in July. So after I said no gigs, then they came and they said, like, hey, it's right down the road and you get a waterfront cabin for 6 nights. And I was like, all right, that's worth
I
making
don't
an
know.
exception. So I'm open to doing, something here and there, but pretty much not going to tour until,
Gotcha.
I think the plan would be to kind of get back out and play in 27 with a new record.
Cool. What are you listening to these days?
I like old blues records, and lately the 30 Songwriter Festival, we just got back from that in Florida. If you're not familiar with that, it's heaven on earth for fans of songwriting. It's a weekend long. There's over 125 artists, playing all along. 30A is like this stretch of scenic road along the Florida Panhandle, looking at the Gulf of Mexico. And by day, they have the main stage where, Mavis Staples and 10,000 Maniacs and the headliners play a big outdoor show in the afternoon. And then in the evening, like anywhere you can throw a stage and a PA, there's a great singer-songwriter. And we're talking, you got James McMurtry, Mary Gauthier. My friend Kim Ritchie was there. We got to perform together. I sat in on a song with her, and I discovered a lot of great music there. And what I really learned was, like, two things. I've been a Fairweather fan. So there were people like Jeff Black, whose record I really appreciated back in the day. And there were others who I was like, I kind of had fallen off and not followed their music. I was like, oh man, I got to stay up on the artists that I admire. Like, I got to keep up with their records. And then there were a lot of these people whose names I've seen around for years, and that I knew they were good, but I just never got exposed to their music. So one example of that was Gretchen Peters. I don't know if
Yeah.
you're familiar. Oh,
Yeah,
You
she's great.
know, a lot of success as a writer, you know, Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame and all of that. But as an artist, yeah, she played one of these in the rounds, and both Elaine and I were just fast fans, man. We just were knocked out. So I've been listening to that. And Will Kimbrough was somebody who I saw perform there, who I had met and knew his work before. And, you know, I've been listening to his record. So I'm doing my homework now, studying up on some of those artists.
Gotcha.
But you know, but typically when I'm not in sort of like my recent mode of like, oh, I need to delve into all the great music that's out there that's, you know, oftentimes sadly flying under the radar, I tend to listen to a lot of old blues music. I've got my little vinyl pile over there, and a lot of times what I do is I just go to the bigger pile and I just bring out, I go, oh, I want to hear that, I want to hear that, and then I just put them in there, and then I randomly pick one out. And so that could be anything from the Trogs to Booker T and the MGs. As far as newer stuff, there's an artist in Seattle named Tomo Nakayama, who's a remarkable singer-songwriter who made a beautiful record called Ocean or Oceans. I got that on vinyl and really loved that. I was listening to the Don Heffington tribute album recently. That's a really cool album. If your viewers aren't familiar with Don, he was most famous as a session drummer, played with Dylan for a minute in the 80s, and has played on lots and lots of records. He was in the band Lone Justice, but unbelievable songwriter, passed away tragically. And after he passed, they put out this record. And yeah, his solo records are really cool. They're bizarre. I mean, they make Guided by Voices sound like Steely Dan. They're just lo-fi and funky and weird with kazoos. It's just bizarre.
Nice.
But his songwriting, I mean, I like it sonically. It's really cool. The songwriting, so skillful. And when we talk about words flowing off the tongue and stuff like that, he was a great songwriter. I'm trying to think who else I can give props to. Just like you mentioned earlier, the person who couldn't think of any of the new artists to mention.
It's good. You've listed quite a few.
Yeah.
Are you a reader? And if so, what have you read lately that you could recommend?
You know, I have been not reading lately, and it's one of those things that I kind of I've been kicking myself. I need to get back in the habit. I've been looking at Mike Campbell's autobiography. We have it. I need to read Cameron Crowe's autobiography, his memoir. I'll just say that I'm in it. Elaine and I are mentioned in the book, and still I've been slow to jump to actually read it. So yeah, I think I spend a little too much time listening to podcasts. It's cutting into my reading time.
I hear you. I've started. I've been a voracious reader my whole life, but I kind of fell off too. I think a lot of it is this culture of distraction we live in. It makes it kind of difficult to sit down and actually sustain focused reading for a while. But I've recently started using it as a practice, as a focus practice, along with my meditation. You know, forcing myself. I'm not getting out of this chair for 45 minutes. You know, I'm gonna read. So.
You're inspiring me. I think the other thing, I do a fair amount of reading on the screen. You know, I have a Substack that I'm really active in. And so I do get some of my sort of prose fix from that. There's some great writing on there, and that could be inspiring. But yeah, you're lighting a fire. I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna make a point.
Good.
Getting back to the page.
Pete Droge, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I encourage people to go check out your new record. Look forward to your next one. Anything else you want to say before we sign off?
Well, I would remind folks that that Necktie Second record, we've got the double vinyl deluxe of that, and I'm sharing a lot around the history of that album right now on my Substack. Speaking of Substack,
okay.
I've been right now I'm in the middle of a multi-part series on the tour and all the support that we did behind that album. And so it's kind of a fun little kind of, you know, drops you into that mid-90s rock and roll world.
Yeah.
So that's kind of cool. Yeah, and the Substack, you know, it's a real passion project for me in that I go deep into the writing process in there. I have a thing called From the Sketchbook, where I literally share little snippets from my iPhone, sketches of songs, and sort of, you know, go through the evolution of how a song came together. And
nice.
So yeah, people can drop over to petedroge.substack.com and check that out. It's free to subscribe.
Okay.
And premium subscribers get some extra perks and stuff like that. But I like the Substack
Yeah.
ecosystem. It's you know, it's ad free. It's not filled with junk and slop and all of that. It's been a pretty neat thing.
Yeah, I agree. Let's hope it stays that way. I'm
I know. I'm
a little
worried. I'm
worried
actually
about it,
I am very much
but
worried about it.
for now, you're right, and I will definitely put a link to your Substack in the show notes. Pete, again, thank you so much. I wish you all the best, and
Thank you.
thanks again for doing this.
Thank you.
Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.